March 17, 1945. The shattered streets of Remagen, Germany. Private Hans Becker crouches in the rubble of what used to be a bakery, his Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon balanced across his knees as the distinctive growl of a Sherman tank's engine echoes off broken walls 2 blocks away. He's 19 years old. He's been in uniform for 6 weeks, and he's about to do something that could get him court-martialed. The Sherman's treads bite into the cobblestones, grinding closer. Becker's squad leader is dead. His corporal is dead. The entire defensive position collapsed 20 minutes ago, and now he's alone with a weapon he's fired exactly twice in training. He slides the activation pin forward, shoulders the tube, and aims at the approaching tank as it rounds the corner 60 meters away. He squeezes the firing mechanism. Nothing happens. The primer hasn't ignited. The Panzerfaust, Germany's answer to Allied armor superiority, the weapon that's supposed to make even a teenage conscript capable of stopping a 30-ton tank, is a dud in his hands. The Sherman's turret begins to traverse toward his position. He has perhaps 10 seconds before that 75mm gun finds him. What Private Becker does next violates every training regulation, every safety protocol, every explicit order he received during his abbreviated instruction on anti-tank weapons. It's the kind of field improvisation that gets soldiers killed far more often than it saves them. But in 7 seconds, that illegal modification will turn a malfunctioning tube into a kill that American tank crews would discuss in horrified debriefs for weeks afterward. By March 1945, Germany's situation had become mathematically unsustainable. The Reich that once commanded from the Atlantic to the Volga was now fighting inside its own borders. American, British, and Soviet forces were converging from 3 directions, and German defenders were increasingly composed of Volkssturm militia, Hitlerjugend teenagers, and the remnants of Wehrmacht units so depleted they existed more on paper than in reality. But Germany still had one significant tactical advantage: the Panzerfaust. Developed in 1943 as a response to Soviet armor tactics, the Panzerfaust was a disposable, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that could penetrate up to 200 millimeters of armor, more than enough to destroy any Allied tank from the front. It was cheap to manufacture, requiring no precision machinery. It was simple enough that a civilian pressed into service could learn to fire it in an afternoon. And it was devastatingly effective at close range. The statistics backed up the threat. In urban combat during the final months of the war, Panzerfaust-equipped infantry accounted for more Allied tank losses than German armor did. The Americans called them stovepipes. British tankers called them tank terrors. What made them particularly deadly was their tactical application. A soldier could fire from a window, a basement, a pile of rubble, and the tank crew would have only the smoke trail to indicate where the shot originated. By then, it was usually too late. The weapon consisted of a simple steel tube with a shaped charge warhead positioned at the forward end and a firing mechanism at the rear. When activated, a small primer charge ignited 54 grams of black powder propellant, launching the warhead at 30 meters per second. The shaped charge, upon impact, would focus explosive force into a superheated jet of metal capable of burning through tank armor like a cutting torch through paper. Captain Michael Harmon, commanding a Sherman tank company in the 9th Armored Division, described the Panzerfaust threat in a post-action report. You can't suppress what you can't see. Jerry could be anywhere: second-floor window, basement hatch, behind a garden wall. By the time you spot the smoke, you're already hit. We lost 4 tanks in Bonn in 6 hours, everyone to Panzerfausts, 0 to actual German armor. The Sherman, despite its legendary reliability and the affection American crews held for it, was not designed for this kind of warfare. Its 76mm frontal armor could stop most German anti-tank rifle rounds, but shaped charges didn't care about armor thickness the way kinetic projectiles did. The Panzerfaust's warhead could punch through the Sherman's side armor at 60 meters with near certainty. At 30 meters, it was essentially unstoppable. What made this threat truly nightmarish for Allied tankers was the quality of German soldiers wielding these weapons. By March 1945, that quality had collapsed. The Panzerfaust was now being issued to men who'd been farmers, shopkeepers, and factory workers weeks earlier. Volkssturm conscripts as young as 16 and as old as 60 were being handed these weapons with minimal instruction and sent to hold impossible positions against overwhelming Allied advances. The training standard had degraded from 2 weeks of instruction to, in some cases, a single afternoon demonstration. Mechanical failures increased as manufacturing quality declined under Allied bombing. Primers failed to ignite. Propellant charges were inconsistent. Some Panzerfausts exploded in their operators' hands. Others simply didn't fire at all. But the weapon remained terrifying because of the sheer numbers involved. By early 1945, Germany was producing approximately 200,000 Panzerfausts per month. Even with failure rates climbing above 20%, that meant tens of thousands of functional anti-tank weapons flooding into the hands of desperate defenders who knew that losing meant the end of everything they'd been told to protect. For Allied tankers advancing into Germany, every destroyed building was a potential ambush. Every street corner was a kill zone. And every teenage conscript with a stovepipe was a threat that could end your war in one terrible second. German tactical doctrine in early 1945 treated Panzerfaust failures as acceptable losses within a larger strategy of attrition. Training manuals acknowledged that 15 to 25% of weapons might malfunction, but emphasized that operators should simply discard the faulty weapon and retrieve another from supply dumps. In theory, this made sense. Why waste time troubleshooting a disposable weapon when replacements were abundant? In practice, on the chaotic streets of collapsing German cities, this doctrine was fatally disconnected from reality. Supply lines had disintegrated. A Volkssturm, private in a forward position, couldn't simply requisition another Panzerfaust when his first one misfired. The supply sergeant was 3 kilometers behind enemy lines, if he was still alive at all. Positions were overrun within minutes of Allied armor appearing. Soldiers like Hans Becker were fighting with whatever ammunition they'd been issued that morning, and when it failed, they died. American tank commanders, meanwhile, had developed a dismissive confidence regarding German anti-tank capabilities that bordered on dangerous complacency. After encountering countless Volkssturm soldiers who fled at the first sight of Shermans, after rolling through towns where the only resistance came from old men with hunting rifles, many crews began to underestimate the lethality of remaining German defenders. Lieutenant Robert Kessler, commanding a Sherman in the 3rd Armored Division, wrote in his diary, "The Wehrmacht that fought us in France is gone. What's left are kids and grandpas who barely know which end of a rifle to point at us. We've stopped buttoning up in towns. Jerry either runs or surrenders. When they do try to fight, their equipment is as worn out as they are." This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. German resistance was collapsing across the Western Front. But it created a fatal tactical error, the assumption that malfunctioning equipment meant no threat at all. Tank crews who would have approached Normandy hedgerows with extreme caution now advanced through German urban areas with hatches open, commanders exposed, speeds too high for infantry support to keep pace. They couldn't have known that desperation breeds innovation at the infantry level faster than any headquarters directive ever could. German soldiers trapped in forward positions with malfunctioning weapons weren't following training manuals anymore. They were improvising. Some attempted to manually ignite Panzerfaust propellant charges using rifle cartridges. Others tried to disassemble primers from working weapons to install in faulty ones. a process that resulted in more accidental detonations than successful repairs. A few desperate men attempted to use Panzerfaust warheads as hand-placed demolition charges, though carrying a shaped charge without its launching tube usually ended with the soldier being shot before reaching the tank. But occasionally, in the narrow margin between regulation and survival, a soldier would discover something that actually worked. These field modifications were never documented in official reports. Wehrmacht officers who survived the war didn't discuss them. Allied intelligence never cataloged them. They existed in the chaotic space where military discipline meets self-preservation, where the rules that govern armies break down into individual choices made in seconds. Then came Remagen and Private Becker and a malfunctioning Panzerfaust that absolutely had to work. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about late-war German anti-tank tactics. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about improvised Panzerfaust modifications before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II combat innovation, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Private Hans Becker wasn't an engineering genius. He wasn't a weapons specialist. 6 weeks earlier, he'd been working in his father's carpentry shop in Bavaria, building furniture for families who still had homes to furnish. But he'd grown up hunting in the Bavarian forest, and he understood the fundamental principle of every firearm he'd ever held. If the primer doesn't ignite, you need more force to make it ignite. The Sherman is 40 meters away now, its turret traversing slowly toward his position. Through the rubble, he can see the tank commander's head and shoulders exposed in the cupola, standard American practice in areas where resistance has collapsed. They're not expecting a fight. Becker's hands shake as he extracts the small percussion cap from the Panzerfaust's firing mechanism. The cap is supposed to ignite when struck by the firing pin, setting off the black powder propellant that launches the warhead. But this cap is either defective or has absorbed moisture during weeks of storage in damp basements and ruined buildings. He has no replacement cap. He has no other Panzerfaust. What he has is 2 rifle cartridges in his pocket and an understanding of how percussion works. The modification takes 8 seconds. He places 1 rifle cartridge, a standard 7.92 57mm Mauser round, directly against the exposed primer cap, holding it in place with his thumb. Then he repositions the Panzerfaust against his shoulder, the weapon now absurdly unbalanced because he's holding a rifle cartridge against the firing mechanism with his left hand while trying to aim with his right. The Sherman is 35 meters away. The turret is still traversing. He can hear American voices now, casual conversation he doesn't understand. What Becker is attempting violates every safety protocol for exactly one reason. If the rifle cartridge detonates instead of simply transferring its percussion force to the Panzerfaust's primer, it will explode directly next to his face. The brass casing will fragment. The explosion will be uncontained. At best, he'll lose his left hand and most of his vision. More likely, he'll die instantly. But the Sherman's 75mm gun is almost pointed at him now, and death in 3 seconds seems more certain than death in 1. He squeezes the Panzerfaust's firing mechanism. The firing pin strikes the base of the rifle cartridge. For a fraction of a second, nothing happens. Then the rifle cartridge's primer ignites with a sharp crack. But instead of detonating the entire cartridge, the percussion force transfers through the bullet and casing directly into the Panzerfaust's primer cap. The cap ignites. The black powder propellant ignites, and 54 grams of explosive force launch the shaped charge warhead from the tube at 30 meters per second. Becker doesn't see the impact. The backblast from the Panzerfaust fills his vision with smoke and dust, and he's already rolling sideways into the rubble, expecting machine gun fire to chew through his last position. The rifle cartridge, miraculously, hasn't exploded in his hand. The force was just enough to trigger the primer without detonating the propellant. The warhead strikes the Sherman's right side armor at a 60-degree angle, precisely where the hull meets the turret ring. The shaped charge detonates, focusing 200 grams of pentolite explosive into a jet of superheated copper moving at 8,000 meters per second. The jet burns through 51 millimeters of armor plating in microseconds, then punches into the tank's interior. Inside the Sherman, the effect is catastrophic. The penetrating jet doesn't just pierce the armor. It creates a cone of molten metal and fragmented steel that explodes into the crew compartment at hypersonic velocity. The gunner, Sergeant Thomas Rayburn, dies instantly as the jet strikes him in the chest. The loader is hit by fragments and collapses across the ammunition racks. The tank commander, still exposed in the cupola, feels the entire vehicle lurch as the crew below him screams. Smoke begins pouring from the turret ring. The driver, Corporal James Mitchell, has perhaps 3 seconds of confused understanding. Something hit them, the crew's hurt, the tank's on fire, before he realizes the ammunition is cooking off. He throws open his hatch and evacuates. The assistant driver follows. They hit the street running as the first secondary explosion rips through the Sherman's interior. 30 seconds after impact, the tank is burning. A minute later, the main gun ammunition detonates with a blast that blows the turret completely off its ring. It lands upside down 6 meters from the chassis, a 4,000-kilogram piece of steel now transformed into a monument to how quickly armored warfare can turn a protected crew into casualties. Becker, still pressed into the rubble 40 meters away, watches the Sherman burn and realizes he's still alive. The modified firing mechanism worked. The improvised percussion transfer worked. The shot was on target. And he's accomplished what the Wehrmacht spent millions of Reichsmarks trying to achieve with precision weapons and trained soldiers. A teenager with 6 weeks of training just killed a Sherman tank with a weapon that wasn't supposed to function. He doesn't celebrate. He can see American infantry advancing 2 blocks over, and he knows the Sherman's destruction will bring immediate retaliation. He abandons the empty Panzerfaust tube, retrieves his rifle, and disappears into the ruins of Remagen before the American infantry reaches the burning tank. He would survive the war. The modification he improvised in 8 seconds of desperation would not be documented in any Wehrmacht training manual, would never appear in any official after-action report, and would be forgotten by history as just another tank lost to enemy fire during the final chaotic weeks of the Third Reich's collapse. But American tank crews who examined the burned-out Sherman found something that deeply disturbed them: rifle cartridge fragments near the Panzerfaust impact site, and evidence that the weapon had been modified in the field. Someone had figured out how to make a broken weapon work, and if one German soldier had figured it out, others could too. The examination of the destroyed Sherman occurred within hours of the engagement. American technical intelligence officers, accustomed to analyzing German anti-tank tactics, discovered the rifle cartridge fragments and immediately understood the implications. A soldier with no specialized training and no functioning equipment had improvised a field modification that bypassed the weapon's safety mechanisms entirely. Captain Gerald Hoffman, an ordnance officer attached to the 9th Armored Division, documented the findings in a technical bulletin distributed to tank companies throughout the Western Front. The language was clinical, but the concern was evident. Enemy personnel have demonstrated capability to modify malfunctioning Panzerfaust weapons using standard rifle ammunition as percussion transfer mechanisms. This modification bypasses normal safety interlocks and may restore functionality to weapons previously assessed as non-threatening. Operators demonstrate willingness to accept significant personal risk to achieve weapon function. What made this discovery particularly unsettling was the mathematical reality it exposed. Allied intelligence estimated that 15 to 25% of German Panzerfausts were malfunctioning due to manufacturing defects and poor storage conditions. Tank crews had been trained to recognize when a Panzerfaust failed to fire. The soldier would typically discard the weapon and retreat, effectively removing himself as a threat. But if even a small percentage of German soldiers adopted this improvised modification technique, the number of functional anti-tank weapons in German hands would increase dramatically. A malfunction was no longer a reprieve. It was a 3-second delay before a potentially lethal attack. The technical analysis revealed why the modification worked. The percussion cap in a standard 7.92mm Mauser rifle cartridge contains approximately 5 milligrams of lead styphnate primer compound. When struck by a firing pin, this compound detonates with sufficient force to ignite the powder charge in the cartridge. But if the cartridge is positioned correctly against the Panzerfaust's primer cap, the percussion wave from the rifle cartridge's primer can transfer through the brass casing and trigger the larger primer in the Panzerfaust itself. It's an incredibly dangerous procedure. The margin for error is measured in millimeters. If the rifle cartridge is positioned even slightly wrong, it will detonate completely, killing the operator. If the Panzerfaust's primer is too degraded, even the transferred percussion force won't ignite it. The technique requires steady hands, precise positioning, and a level of desperation that overrides basic survival instinct. Testing captured Panzerfausts with simulated malfunctions, American ordnance specialists achieved a success rate of approximately 40% using the rifle cartridge method. 60% of attempts either failed to ignite the Panzerfaust or resulted in catastrophic failure of the rifle cartridge. No trained American soldier, when given the choice, volunteered to attempt the modification under combat conditions. But German soldiers in March 1945 weren't operating under normal risk calculations. They were defending towns where their families lived. They were following orders from officers who would shoot them for desertion. They were told that every hour of resistance bought time for wonder weapons to arrive, for peace negotiations to begin, for some miraculous reversal of fortune that would save Germany from total defeat. In that context, a 40% chance of destroying a tank versus a 60% chance of dying while trying was better than the 100% chance of being overrun without fighting back. The tactical bulletins distributed to Allied tank crews reflected this new reality. Tank commanders were instructed to maintain closed hatches in all urban areas, regardless of apparent resistance levels. Infantry support was to clear buildings before armor advanced. Any German soldier observed with a Panzerfaust, functional or apparently malfunctioning, was to be engaged immediately rather than waiting to confirm hostile intent. The assumptions that had made urban operations relatively safe for American armor in early 1945 were revised. A broken weapon was no longer a neutralized threat. It was a threat that might take slightly longer to materialize. The immediate tactical impact of this improvisation technique was limited by a simple fact. The war ended 8 weeks after the Remagen engagement. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the vast majority of Volkssturm soldiers never learned about the rifle cartridge modification because Wehrmacht communications networks had essentially ceased to function. The technique remained isolated to individual soldiers who independently discovered it through desperation rather than disseminated training. Private Hans Becker survived the final weeks of the war and surrendered to American forces on April 24, 1945. During interrogation, he made no mention of his improvised modification, partly because he didn't realize it was significant, and partly because admitting to destroying an American tank seemed unwise while sitting across from American intelligence officers. He was processed through a POW camp, released in August 1945, and returned to Bavaria to resume working in his father's carpentry shop. He died in 1998, and there is no evidence he ever discussed the Remagen engagement publicly. The 4 American crewmen aboard the destroyed Sherman had varied fates. Sergeant Rayburn and the loader, Private First Class Daniel O'Connor, died in the initial strike. Tank Commander Lieutenant Howard Banks and the assistant driver survived with injuries and were evacuated to field hospitals. Corporal Mitchell, the driver, would later write that the speed of the attack, from first impact to catastrophic ammunition detonation, was approximately 45 seconds, faster than any engagement he'd experienced in 8 months of combat. But the intellectual legacy of this improvisation extended far beyond World War II. Post-war analysis of anti-tank warfare emphasized the critical importance of weapon reliability over sophistication. The American M72 law, developed in the early 1960s, incorporated multiple redundant firing mechanisms specifically to prevent the kind of malfunction that forced Becker's improvisation. Soviet RPG-7 development included extensive environmental testing to ensure primers would function in moisture, extreme cold, and degraded storage conditions. Modern military training doctrine now explicitly addresses field improvisation under the category of adaptive problem-solving under combat stress. Special Forces courses teach soldiers to evaluate risk versus reward ratios when considering modifications to malfunctioning equipment. The underlying principle that a soldier facing imminent death will attempt solutions that peacetime safety regulations would never permit is now formally recognized in military psychology research. The broader lesson absorbed by NATO forces during the Cold War was counterintuitive. Unreliable enemy weapons are more dangerous than reliable ones, not less, because unreliability forces improvisation, and improvisation sometimes produces solutions that standard doctrine never anticipated. A Soviet soldier with a malfunctioning RPG who might attempt a field modification represents a more unpredictable threat than one following standard procedures. Historical assessments of late-war German anti-tank effectiveness often focus on the Panzerfaust's technical specifications and deployment numbers. Less frequently discussed is the psychological profile of soldiers willing to risk immediate death to make broken equipment functional. That willingness, born from desperation, indoctrination, or simple determination to fight back against overwhelming odds, was perhaps more dangerous than the weapon itself. In the calculus of armored warfare, a burning Sherman tank destroyed by a teenager with a malfunctioning weapon represents more than a tactical loss. It represents the moment when standard threat assessments failed to account for human desperation. Military doctrine is written by officers in secure headquarters, tested on training ranges with functional equipment, and distributed to soldiers who are expected to follow procedures that assume the world operates according to plan. But combat is what happens when those plans encounter reality, when the weapon doesn't fire, when the enemy doesn't retreat, when the safe option disappeared 30 seconds ago, and survival demands choices that no training manual ever anticipated. Private Becker's improvisation wasn't genius. It was desperation transformed into action in the 8 seconds between malfunction and death. It violated every safety regulation, because safety regulations are written for people who have the luxury of surviving long enough to face consequences. In that moment, trapped in rubble with a tank bearing down, the calculation was simple: die following the rules, or risk dying while breaking them. The Sherman burning in the streets of Remagen was the 447th American tank lost in the European theater. The crew members were among the 1,576 American tankers killed in March 1945 alone. The engagement lasted 45 seconds from first shot to evacuation, and it happened because a malfunctioning weapon met a soldier who refused to accept that malfunction as defeat. Sometimes, the difference between a neutralized threat and a lethal one is not the weapon's condition, it's the desperation of the person holding it. That truth, learned on the collapsing streets of Nazi Germany, remains uncomfortable because it suggests that even total material superiority cannot eliminate human unpredictability. One broken weapon, one illegal modification, one Sherman crew that learned too late that desperation outweighs regulation. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.